thing that can happen, and this is very relevant in the abortion case, for example, is that you can end up with a patchwork where in some parts of the country an appellate court has given one ruling that's at odds with the law in another part of the country. And the Supreme Court is supposed to resolve those circuit splits, as they're called. And if the court can't do that because it doesn't have 9 people, an odd number of people for a majority, then you would have a weird situation where Texas might have very few abortion clinics, but the rest of the country would have a different kind of law that would require the states to not impose regulations that close clinics. And that is not an ideal situation, especially if you think of it maintaining itself for like a year or two.
We're almost out of time with Emily Bazelon, who writes about the Supreme Court and other things for the New York Times Magazine and talks on the Slate Political Gabfest and is the Truman Capote Fellow at Yale. But I didn't even ask you yet about your idea, or the idea that you endorsed in your Times article the other day, of appointing justices for 18-year terms instead of for life. What would that accomplish?
It would take a lot of the weird herky-jerky out of the confirmation process, I think. I mean, the argument for it, and I should say this is not my idea. Scholars like Stephen Calabresi on the right have floated it. There are lots of liberal professors and others who think this is a good idea too. Basically, you would do it so that each president got 2 appointments. They would be staggered, and that would hopefully take some of the political ferocity out of the process, where there would be an expectation that whoever controlled the presidency would get these 2 appointments, and then the next party wouldn't know that if it won the next election, it would get 2 appointments. And maybe that would take some of the heat out of what's become just this incredibly polarized process.
Okay, let's end on one question of Supreme Court trivia. Are you ready?
Uh-oh.
This Monday, February 22nd, will mark the 10th anniversary of something for one of the Supreme Court justices. Do you know what it is?
I have no idea, Brian. Please tell me.
February 22nd, 2016 will be the 10th anniversary of the last time that Clarence Thomas asked a question from the bench.
Oh, that's so interesting. So I've been wondering whether he might start asking questions, because he's the other diehard originalist on the court. And so if Scalia's not there, Scalia asks lots of questions. And maybe now with Scalia's absence, Thomas will feel like there are particular questions he needs to air that nobody else is talking about.
Or it'll make us start believing in ghosts.
But maybe he should choose the 10th anniversary to break this and speak up.
Emily Bazelon, thanks a lot. Thank you very much.
Thanks for having me.
Brian Lehrer on WNYC. Coming up next, we're going to check up on this several-day-old ceasefire agreement with respect to Syria that Fred Kaplan from Slate says is neither a ceasefire nor an agreement. Stay with us.
An uncontroversial Supreme Court justice who was also its most conservative.
When I was confirmed 98-0. I don't think I could get 60 votes today.
Antonin Scalia railed against putting politics into the selection of judges and warned it would just create a monster. The new monster issue for the 2016 campaign. That's next time on The Takeaway, weekday afternoons at 3 on 93.9 FM.
WNYC receives support from Rutgers University's Mason Gross School of the Arts, presenting Stravinsky's The Soldier's Tale at Nicholas Music Center in New Brunswick, New Jersey, February 20th at 7:30 p.m. More info at masongross.rutgers.edu. The Town Hall, presenting From Moses to Mostel, A History of the Jews According to Musical Theater, hosted by comedian Robert Klein with musical guests The Klezmatics and more. Saturday, February 27th, thetownhall.org. The Jerome L. Green Foundation, committed to New York City's cutting-edge performing, digital, and visual arts communities.
Today on the Leonard Lopate Show, hear about the tumultuous history of Sri Lanka and how its natural world has remained largely untouched despite its political conflicts. That's today at noon on WNYC. Brian Lehrer on WNYC. Last Friday, Secretary of State Kerry announced that the 19 nations attempting to end the war in Syria reached an agreement on a ceasefire. Hope was in the air. The pause in fighting is meant to allow humanitarian aid to be given to the areas in Syria impacted by the war. My next guest, Fred Kaplan, Slate's War Stories columnist, writes, "The commitment is very loose, and the ceasefire it sets forth is riddled with so many pockets of permissible violence that it's barely worthy of the name. But still, with Reuters reporting that yesterday approximately 50 civilians were killed when missiles fired by Russian-backed Syrian troops hit 5 medical centers and 2 schools in rebel-held Syrian towns, even a minuscule decrease in violence would be welcome." Fred Kaplan joins me now. He's also the author of a forthcoming book, Dark Territory, The Secret History of Cyber War, which will be out in a couple of weeks. Hi, Fred. Welcome back to WNYC.
Hi, thanks.
First, what are you hearing about these recent bombings of the 5 medical centers and 2 schools in Syria on Monday? Apparently, at least one of the medical centers is another one where Doctors Without Borders is involved. Were these medical centers and schools fully operational at the time of the attack? And Doctors Without Borders, I think, is saying, like they said about the attack in Afghanistan, very separately, that it seemed to be intentionally on that target.
Yeah, they seem to have been fully operational and, in fact, filled with health workers and children and mothers and other patients. As for a deliberate attack, I don't know. As I understand it, the Russian Air Force has not had any so-called smart bombs available in its arsenal for weeks, maybe even months now. After the first several days of bombing in Syria, they essentially ran out of smart bombs. Most of the planes they're using aren't even equipped with the kinds of sensors you need to drop them. In other words, the kind of munitions that home in on a target with spectacular accuracy. This is just sort of massive bombardment. Hit what's ever there. It's terrorizing. It's aerial terrorizing, basically, which I guess if you do enough of it can have a short-term impact in making structures crumble and people flee.
Turkey is blaming Russia. Is there evidence to back that up that you know of? And why would it be in Russia's interest to have things like this bombed?
Well, look, this is the thing about this so-called anti-ISIS coalition that's operating in Syria. I forget who's put it this way, but it's very succinct, that in the anti-ISIS coalition, the United States is the only power that deems ISIS its number one enemy. Everybody else has enemies that they deem much more serious that are all part of this same coalition. The Turks, they want to keep the Kurds from gaining power. The Saudis, they want to keep Iran out of the area. Russia just wants to hang on to its foothold in Syria, which is its only military outpost and alliance outside the former Soviet Union. All of these powers are doing all kinds of things in the name of fighting terrorism, but they regard each other as terrorists. They are not going after the outfit that the terrorist organization that we're there to try to degrade and destroy.
So in your article, you say the ceasefire agreement is neither a ceasefire nor an agreement. Want to take them one at a time?
Yeah. Well, what Secretary Kerry said in his statement in Munich was that they had agreed for a cessation of hostilities against ISIS and al-Nusra Front, which is another jihadist organization very tightly aligned with ISIS. It's another spin-off of al-Qaeda in Syria. But that's not quite what the document says. The document says that the pause in fighting will not apply to fighting against ISIS, the al-Nusra Front. Then here's a quote, or other groups designated as terrorist organizations by the United Nations Security Council, of which, of course, Russia is a member. Now, this grows out of an agreement that took place in Vienna last year. It's pretty much the same words, and then Jordan was given the assignment of coming up with a list of who should be designated terrorist organizations. And then they were going to submit that to the Security Council. But even then, each member of this 21-nation alliance against ISIS, supposedly, was given kind of a veto power to add its own names to the list. Well, long story short, Jordan never came up with this list because it's kind of politically difficult. The Security Council has never come up with a list. So basically, Russia could keep doing what it's doing, the Turks could keep doing what they're doing, the Saudis could keep doing what they're doing, and all of them could say, well, you know, we're just taking advantage of this exemption that we can continue to go after terrorists. Because according to the Russians, for example, any armed group other than the Syrian military and its allies is by definition a terrorist organization. They're trying to bring down Assad's regime, and that's their chief interest. From the Turks' point of view, the Kurds are terrorist organizations. So when I said this is neither an agreement nor a ceasefire, the ceasefire will continue. I mean, the fighting will continue, and it's not an agreement even on the terms of the ceasefire if there were any inclination to have one.
And you wrote in your Slate article, the ceasefire locks in the territorial gains that Syrian army troops, meaning Assad, backed by Russian airstrikes, have recently made in Aleppo, and will thus allow them to consolidate their control without worrying about fire from insurgents.
Well, I said that's true if there is a ceasefire.
Right.
If this does regard a ceasefire, then it could have been agreed to so rapidly. Again, I'm not a mind reader, I don't know, to freeze the situation in Aleppo, where finally, after many weeks of fighting, the Syrian army broke through and forced the anti-Assad rebels into a retreat.
So if that's the case, why would Kerry consider it a good thing?
Kerry, you know, the good thing and the bad thing about Kerry is that he is an inveterate optimist. You know, I don't know too many secretaries of state who would have kept at it as long as he did on the Iran nuclear deal. And, you know, it resulted in a very good deal. At the same time, I don't know very many secretaries of state who would have kept at the possibility of an Israeli-Palestinian peace setting as long as he did. And it didn't break through. And his incessant preoccupation with getting it, a fantasy of any American diplomat for decades now, was a gigantic distraction from a lot of other issues that he could have been dealing with.
Would this ceasefire, if it does take hold, and even with the advantages that it might give to Assad, locking him into power for longer and locking up some of the recent gains on the battlefield, still be a good thing, maybe just on the basis that Kerry announced that it would stop some considerable amount of the killing going forward and allow some humanitarian aid to get to people where they need it?
I think so. To my mind, at this point, the source of instability and violence, not only in Syria and throughout the Middle East, but also spreading through the flooding of refugees throughout Europe, is the war itself. At this point, I'm not even. I am more interested in just stopping the war, regardless of the geostrategic consequences of that. As far as I'm concerned, and I think Kerry might feel the same way, if you kept the political balance the way it is in perpetuity, but there was no more fighting, I think that would be an unequivocally good thing. Now, the problem is this. I've just uttered kind of a geopolitical absurdity, because, you know, and this is a tragic thing to say about the human condition and all that, but war is generally not just a bunch of nuttiness. People fight to attain certain goals. And when you have people fighting for sort of millenarian goals, they're all the more fanatical, not just in their beliefs, but in their fighting. And therefore, as long as these political obstacles are still there, and this includes the continued reign of Assad, and it includes the continuing tensions between the Kurds and the Turks, which go back centuries, then you're not going to have a cessation of fighting. Neither we nor there is no power in the region, and certainly not the United Nations either, that is interested in putting enough firepower on the ground to really enforce a true ceasefire.